So hi everyone, it's Alexa. Welcome back to Digital ELA LOT. I miss you guys. I hope you're all staying safe. We're going to keep these videos up and we hope you guys keep watching. This is the second video to our second lesson. If you haven't already, please watch Aisha's video first. She's going to explain function questions again. Hopefully it should be a reminder because we already talked about them in class. And go over annotations, which we're going to also use in this video. There's also going to be a link in the description to a worksheet, and those questions are going to be the ones that we're going over today. So before you watch this, do the worksheet on your own, and then we'll come together again. Okay. So we're going to really quickly review some function question tips. Aisha already explained this, so again, make sure you watch that already. And we did it in class, so you guys should remember. But for function questions, we're really going to try to understand why the author included a sentence, a word, a paragraph, and usually that reasoning has to do with contributing to the main idea. So that's why we're making you annotate, and we're trying to make you really understand the main idea of the passage, because that is really going to help you answer these questions. So now we're going to go over each question. We have 6 normal questions and we wrote 4 function questions. So we're going to go over the beginning ones a little quickly. If you have any questions, feel free to email us, but we want to focus more in depth on the function questions today. So question 1, which detail about March provides support for the author's statements in lines 55 to 58? So when you read this, you automatically go to lines 55 through 58, and we're going to read them together. Although he pointed out environmental damage caused by irresponsible human activities, Marsh did not oppose every human alteration to the environment. So it's asking us what provides support. So we're probably looking for something that has a human alteration to the environment. Alteration is sort of an interference or a change or repair. So we're looking for human interference in the environment now in our answer choices. So let's read through the answer choices. A, his reputation as a radical thinker. Does that have a human alteration to the environment? No. B, his contributions to the conservation movement. That again doesn't have to do with what we're looking for. C, his experience working as an ambassador. Again, has nothing to do with human alterations to the environment. And D, his approval of beneficial human-made projects in nature. So this clearly is a human-made project in nature. Humans are interfering with the environment. So the answer is C. Question 2, which of Marsh's ideas most influenced the environmental movement of the 1960s? So we're going to look right here. I found in the first paragraph, there's a sentence that says 1960, so that's a huge clue that we have to look there. And it says, talking about the book, its message, that Western society was in the process of causing irreparable harm to the environment, greatly influenced ecologists during the beginning of the modern environmental movement in the 1960s. So it's basically saying that Western society, whatever humans are doing in the Western society is what is damaging the environment. And that idea affected the 1960s. So now that we already have our answer in our head, we're going to look through all of them, make sure we have the right one. So choice A, some human alterations to the environment are necessary. That is not what we discovered was the main idea that they took from it. B, people lack an understanding of the environment. Maybe this is true, but that's not what the main message was. We already know the main message, that humans are causing damage to the environment. C, human activities could damage the environment. We already know this is the answer pretty much, but we have to check every single one, just like we did in our last video. And so yes, there's the environmental degradation has been occurring for many years. So degradation is pretty much damage for this question. And that's again, that is not Marsh's main idea that influenced the environmental movement. So we know our answer is C. Question 3, which statement best describes the central idea of the passage? So before we even look at the answer choices, we already have an idea of what the central idea of the passage is, because we already did that in Aisha's video, and the annotations really helped us with that, I'm sure. So even before, we want to think in our heads, after you read this passage, what did we take from it? And pretty much it's about Marsh and how he had this idea a long time ago that didn't really apply, that humans were harming the environment and would be extremely hurtful to the environment. And years later, suddenly there's a movement that applies with that and that took his ideas that maybe weren't very relevant back then and now is kind of mainstream ideas. So now we're going to look through and see which that kind of goes for. So choice A, Marsh's experience growing up on a farm allowed him to witness firsthand how humans' demands on nature can lead to problems. And as an adult, he wrote one of his first books on conservation. So even though this is true, it doesn't really give us a central idea of a passage. It just highlights certain events that happened in the passage. Choice B, Marsh challenged the notion that nature can repair the damage people cause to it, but he also supported human-made modifications to nature that improve transportation and commerce. So the area of the passage that talks about that is very small, and that's kind of a specific detail when we're talking more about the central idea of the entire passage. So even though this is true, this isn't the central idea. C, Marsh's ideas about the environment were considered radical in his lifetime, but they later gained popularity during the environmental movement in the 20th century. This is a main part of the main idea, but we don't know if this is the answer yet because it doesn't even tell us what the ideas about the environments are. It just tells us about how he was radical and then his ideas became popular. D, Marsh was a radical thinker who believed that people's actions could dramatically affect nature, and his writings are considered foundational to the conservation movement. So this combines all of the ideas that we talked about in the beginning and kind of summarizes the entire passage pretty well. Yeah, so the answer is D. Okay, so question 4. Marsh believed that people of his time caused harm to the environment because, so let's look at all the choices. Choice A, they assumed that future generations would solve any environmental problems. Nowhere in the text did we really talk about future generations. This is where annotating really helps, because if you had wrote on the side generations, you would have to think twice, but you didn't, so you can get rid of this one. The same logic applies to B. They thought industrial process was more important than protecting nature. They didn't ever say anything about people prioritizing industrial progress over nature. C, they were unwilling to change farming and waste disposal practices. Again, they didn't really know that there was an issue as much as there was, so how are they going to do this? Okay, choice D, they lacked knowledge of nature and natural processes. So we already know that this was written a really long time ago before anything about the environment was popular. Now we see that there's the climate strikes and everything is really relevant, but back then in the 1800s, nobody really thought about it like this. So we can see in paragraph 3, he says, Marsh attributed this to what he called, quote, man's ignorant disregard for the laws of nature. So what does ignorant mean? You ignore it, you put it out of your head, you're not thinking about it. And disregard means that, again, you're putting it out of your head. So these people at the time didn't even understand that this was a problem in nature. So the answer is D. Okay, so this is our first function question. We're going to be going into it a little bit more. So it says, what is most likely the reason the author uses the word surprisingly in paragraph 1? So again, why did the author use this word? It has to have a meaning, a significance. So we're going to go to paragraph 1. In the beginning of the paragraph, it talks about his ideas, Marsh's ideas, and how they applied to the 1960s movement. But then after that, he says, Marsh was not, however, part of this movement. So he wasn't part of the 1960s movement. Surprisingly, Man and Nature was first published in 1864. So it's telling us, even before these ideas were popular and this was an issue that everyone cared about, Marsh had already written this book a long time before then. So choice A, to argue that Marsh's ideas are more applicable in the present than they were during his lifetime. So it doesn't ever say this. It actually says how Marsh thought that it was really important during his lifetime and how he saw different examples of how humans were hurting his environment. There was an example of deforestation in Vermont in paragraph 2, land mismanagement in Italy in paragraph 3, and his passion for it showed that he really thought it was important at his time. So this answer choice doesn't really make sense. So choice B, to show that Marsh introduced ideas a century before they became widely accepted. That's kind of what we already mentioned in the beginning of the paragraph. It talks about how the movement is important now or since the 1960s, but he had this idea way before anyone else caught on. So this is a good choice so far. Okay, so choice C, to emphasize that Marsh was unaware that his ideas would help begin a conservation movement. It's very possible he was unaware that it would have this big of an impact, but that's not the reason that the author used surprisingly in this case, and it doesn't really have to do with the first paragraph, which is where we're looking. D, to prove that there would be fewer issues with the environment today if people had accepted Marsh's ideas earlier, even though this would be true. It doesn't really, that's not really the context that they're mentioning it. They're not saying, unfortunately, nobody listened to him. They're not saying any of that. They're just stating a fact that he had this idea way before anyone else did. So the answer is B. Okay, question 6. This is not a function question, so we're going to go quickly. Which evidence supports the accuracy of Marsh's theories about nature? So we're looking for what proves that Marsh's theories about nature were true. So choice A, the details about Marsh's observations of environmental degradation. So Marsh's theories about nature are already based on his observations, so we need other proof other than that. Choice B doesn't really explain whether or not Marsh's theories are accurate. They just say that they inspired a movement. Choice C, the details about how Marsh's ideas are essential to modern environmental science. So with choice C, it's saying how Marsh's ideas and his theories about nature are applied to modern environmental science. So that kind of shows us that they were accurate, because if they weren't, then we wouldn't use them today and we wouldn't base modern science on it. Choice D, the details about Marsh's opinions on human alterations to the environment. So this just shows his opinions. This doesn't really show whether or not it was true. So this question, it was really important to understand what it is asking us, which is, how do we know that Marsh's theories are true? So the answer is C. So question 7, why does the author use the word furthermore in paragraph 6? So what's the use of furthermore? We already talked about transition words when we explained function questions in class, but I would ask you guys what furthermore means, but pretty much it just means adding on to what I already said. I'm going to say more that has to do with it. So for example, if I wrote a paragraph about cookies and I said, furthermore, cookies have had a huge impact on society, whatever. It just basically tells us that it's adding on to what we already said, and it's the same topic, similar. So in paragraph 6, he says, furthermore, he asserted that everything in nature is significant, etc. So the paragraph before, he's talking about Marsh's ideas. So if he's saying, furthermore, he asserted, we know that in paragraph 6, he's going to continue to talk about Marsh's ideas in his book. So let's look at the choices. Choice A, to transition to a discussion about a different topic. We already know what furthermore means, so we know that's not true. B, to raise a counterclaim to a previous argument. Furthermore shows that it's positive, so it shows that the two things have to do with each other. So counterclaim is negative, so it's no. C, to discuss a previous concept in further detail. That's what we said furthermore was about, so that could be the answer. Or D, to state the main idea of that paragraph. So this is a transition word. It's not necessarily any sort of thesis or main idea. We're continuing. So the answer is C. So question 8, why does the author use the word heavy in paragraph 2? So this is similar. It's asking us why the author chose a certain word. So let's look back. It says the heavy demand for firewood had depleted the forest. So here it's describing the demand for firewood. So it's saying that there is a lot of demand. Something's heavy, it's huge, it's a big demand for something. So it's a description. So let's look at the answer choices. A, to say that there was an exceptionally high demand for firewood. That makes sense, like we said. For choice B, to say that firewood weighed a lot. So here it says the heavy demand. Heavy is describing demand. Demand cannot be weighed necessarily. So it's used in a different way here. But that could be a trick question, so we have to be careful. And that's why we have to go back to the text, because if you didn't, You get that question wrong. So choice C, to differentiate the demand in Vermont from demand in other areas he had mentioned. In this paragraph, he's just talking about Vermont in paragraph 2, so it's not comparing it in any sort of way, so that is incorrect. So choice D, to specify the extent to which the forest has been depleted. Choice D could confuse us because we are talking about how the forests have been depleted, which pretty much means wiped out. So the trees were cut down. But again, the word heavy specifically is just describing demand. So it's not talking about the forest. It's talking about the demand for the firewood. So to answer this question, we really have to understand what heavy is describing, and it's describing demand. As I read this question, what I did is pretend that this is a text. I circled heavy, which is what we're asking about, and I drew an arrow to demand. So that tells me exactly what the word is describing, and it'll make answering this question much, much easier for me. So I recommend doing that for you guys as well. Okay, so why does the author include the details of Marsh's childhood in Vermont? So what purpose does it serve to the passage to share the details of his childhood? So, and you can see that his childhood in Vermont is in the second paragraph. So we're going to go back and reread it in our heads. And we'll look over the answer choices with that in mind. So choice A, to emphasize the importance of Marsh's education. Nowhere in that paragraph does it mention education. So right away we can get rid of it. We know where we're looking and we know what we're looking for. So choice B, to provide background information and explain the reasons for his later beliefs. So what did he say about his childhood? He said the forest had been depleted, sheep grazing had stripped the land. The result was flooding and soil erosion. Streams were fouled by wastes dumped from numerous mills and dye houses. So it's talking about all of these human actions that had affected his environment when he was younger and how he saw all of that. He said Marsh first observed the environmentally destructive effects of human activities while growing up in Vermont. So these details are used to show how Marsh's ideas begin to form in his head since he was a little kid. Okay, so choice C, to contrast the untouched scenery of Vermont with the environmental damage he would witness later in his life. So did it say here that Vermont was perfect? No, it said all of the flaws about Vermont. D, to introduce the main idea of the passage. So we already know this is in the second paragraph. We already introduced the main idea in the first paragraph. This is just giving us details, which is what the question asks. So we know that that's incorrect as well. And so the best answer choice is clearly C. So question 10, why does the author include Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, and others in paragraph 8? So we're going to go to paragraph 8 and read that sentence. By the late 19th century, however, his writings, along with those of John Muir, Henry David Thoreau, and others, had inspired what had become known as the conservation movement. So he's comparing Marsh's writings with these authors and saying that they're very similar. Choice A, to begin a discussion about Henry David Thoreau's ideas. His name was just mentioned. We never went into a deeper discussion about his ideas, so we can automatically say no. Choice B, to show that Marsh had opponents who did not believe in the conservation of nature. Did we say these were opponents? No, we said that they had similar writings and they had similar ideas, and all of these authors helped contribute to the conservation movement. C, to prove that Marsh was one of the least influential writers of the conservation movement. It never says that Henry or John were more influential. It just says that they also influenced. So this also doesn't really make sense because the whole entire passage is talking about how influential Marsh is. So we should be able to get rid of that as well. Let's read D, to provide examples of other radical thinkers that would influence the conservation movement. So this one is clearly the answer because it says that all of them inspired the movement. And that was the reason that the author included their names. All right, so we finished going over the questions. What I want you guys to take away from this is for function questions, we're really getting in the head of the author. We want to understand why a sentence was used, why a paragraph was used, and how it contributes to the main idea. For every single type of question, finding the main idea is really important. So I hope you guys keep that up. And I hope you all are staying safe. Please keep watching these videos. We're going to work hard to make them as best as we can. And we miss you guys. Bye.